My name is Brad Westwood. I'm Senior Public Historian, and it's my pleasure to be the chair and respondent to our session today. The title, those of you who, just to be sure you're in the right place, is Material and Visual Culture. We have three presenters, all three whom will present for 20 minutes. All three have very interesting visual graphic presentations, as one would think appropriate for material culture. And then we'll ask all three of our speakers to come up and sit here at the front, and we're going to give enough time and space for some interesting interaction and questions, hopefully from you as an audience. Our first speaker is John M. Hartvigsen. I don't know why anyway, someone I've known for 15 years, so I stammer on my wife's name. Flag Research Center. His title is The Story of John Smith's Old Flag. Now, John has been a long-time staple in the area of flag history here in Utah. He was born and raised in Utah, educated at BYU and the University of Utah. He won the William Driver in 1982 and 2010, and the John Purcell Award in 2013, and I believe that is with the Vexillologists International Society. So this is a prominent. These are prominent awards. He's worked for the state legislature in securing passage of 2 legislative measures to correct the Utah state flag, and just recently he's been in some discussions related to the idea of, does Utah want or need a new flag? And so he has been a consultant to many people. Our second speaker today is Terri Wesemann from Utah State University. Her presentation is Metal Storytellers, Reflection of War Culture in Sulverplate B29 Nose Art from the 509 Composite Group. Now, Terri is an adjunct or a teacher, instructor at Utah State in the history of aviation in America. She's also a graduate instructor for technical communication courses at Utah State. She has led a life in aviation. She's a military spouse. She has a master's degree in American Studies with a focus on folklore from Utah State. And then Anali Rappleye is from our third speaker, is from the Utah Division of State History. Her remarks are the Scenic Route, historic film locations in Utah. Anali has been a wonderful contributor to Utah State history and to the archaeological program for now, I think, 4 years. She has not only been someone who understands the process and the methodology of archaeology, but she is also a very keen person when it comes to records, archiving, field work. She's just what I would say a kind of a grand performer in state history and in the archaeological program. Well, these are our three presenters, and now I'm going to turn time over 20 minutes to John.
Okay, in 1897, it was the 50th anniversary of the arrival of the Mormon pioneers in the Salt Lake Valley. And just like every year, there was a great big 24th of July parade. It was led off by soldiers and veterans, as usually the case, a great many of them. And you can expect that these veterans also carried the flags, which are called colors or standards of their various organizations. And we don't know much about flags that were carried in various parades, but in a few there's an indication. In this parade, the Deseret News talked about one flag twice. And you'll notice from this we find a couple of places. John Smith is called the color bearer and the original color bearer, and he's carrying a flag of the lifeguards with the motto, "Always Ready." So that's quite a bit of information, actually. Not only that, there were 2 photographs of John Smith taken immediately after the parade. There was this one, and then another one. We'd have to ask, well, why was this flag important that it was mentioned twice in the Deseret News, that we can figure out what flag it was, and then they took the time to photograph it twice after the parade. Well, we need to know several things about this flag. The flag's provenance, where it came from, who had it, the flag's accompanying story. There's usually a story that is with the flag, and sometimes these are pretty good stories and sometimes they're not so good. And then the flag's documentation, what is their physical documentation and in the written documentation about this flag. And one of the most important things, I believe, in the flag's documentation is the artifact itself. It can tell us many things about the flag. Well, here we have the bear flag, and let's consider its provenance first. Let's a couple of examples. This flag is up at the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, and its provenance certainly came down through the family, but the story that came down with it, when I did research on it, just didn't hold up. Supposedly it came across the plains with Brigham Young in 1847. No, it didn't. I doubt it even came across the plains. I wrote a paper about that, but that's another story. But at any rate, as I checked the provenance and the story of this flag, although who had the flag, they were a descendant of the maker of the flag, I believe, but the story just didn't hold up. Here's another one for the Mormon Battalion. This one, if you've gone to the armory out at Lagoon at Pioneer Village, you've seen this flag. And it's been accepted by some people as being the flag carried by the Mormon Battalion. But the physical flag itself just doesn't hold this up. If you have 1847 on a flag, and that didn't become an important year until several years thereafter. Certainly not when they were enlisted in 1846. The little flag up in the canton is interesting, but it's a flag of Deseret, again dating to a later period. The flag is only one-sided, and I believe it was a flag made to be carried in a parade by veterans. So now let's consider the provenance of this flag. I started here with Hiram Smith. He is the father of John Smith. And the reason I included him is there's something special about the provenance of this flag. There were many items in the Smith family history that were maintained on a basis of inherited by the eldest son to the eldest son to the eldest son, as was the office at that time of the patriarchs of the church. And so the concern for these items was much different than you would have in other groups, because it is the Hiram Smith family. John Smith, who was the original color bearer for the lifeguards in the Mormon Battalion, was the son of Hiram Smith. He was not a city slicker businessman, but he was a rough and tumble cowboy who brought many wagon trains west, and he served in the lifeguards or Minutemen of the Nauvoo Legion. He maintained this flag. He maintained this flag while he was color bearer, and then when the Nauvoo Legion was disbanded, he kept it, added it to the other artifacts maintained by the family, and when he died, it was inherited by his son Hiram Fisher Smith, then Henry Gibbs Smith, then Elder G. Smith. And I'm talking mainly about Elder G because he's the one that I did a great deal of my research. Elder G died at 107 a few years ago, and his son E. Gary Smith now maintains the flag. The accompanying story is the other thing, and here this chain of evidence, in law, they don't want to know just where it is now and who had it originally, but they want a chain of evidence, which we have. I just showed you for this flag, and it's a chain of evidence also for the story, because each of those individuals was able, as an adult, to talk to the individual who had the flag before, and it was part of this family history, so very important. I wish I had an earlier version of the story. The earliest one I could find was in 1967 in the home version of the Salt Lake Tribune. And there was an article written there about this flag, and the story is told there. Basically, the story is that John Smith, who is a member of the lifeguards and the color bearer of the lifeguards, that he maintained the flag after the disbanding of the Nauvoo Legion in Utah, and kept it for the rest of his life. The story is that, in the family story, is that this was the flag that was brought out of Nauvoo and belonged to Brigham Young and was hoisted in a tree when the Mormon battalion was enrolled. This picture is rather fanciful. Brigham there must be a time traveler, came back from the 1870s to enlist the battalion. His beard, I don't think he had that kind of a suit with him on that day. At any rate, such is the way we remember history sometimes. That flag, according to the story, was too big to be carried on a flag staff, or a pike, they called it, when the Mormon battalion was marching. And it was too fragile, it wouldn't have made it. It's on cotton, we'll talk about that later. But at any rate, the story is that the folded flag was placed in a box in the supply wagon of the battalion, and it went to California, not being carried, but in that supply wagon. And in California, it may have been displayed in San Diego, according to the family story, and then it made it eventually up to Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, at Fort Moore, the first U.S. flag was flown over that city. But I think that flag was probably a flag that they got from the Navy that was out in the harbor, rather than the flag that the Mormon battalion had brought with them. But while they were in California, in compliment to the Bear Flag Republic, the bear was painted over the stripes, the red and white stripes of the flag. It wasn't there originally. That according to the family story. Now, people wonder about our flag here because it has a standing bear. Well, there were many bear flags in California. This is the flag of William Brown Ide, who was the commander of the troops under the Bear Flag Republic. And so it's more likely they would have seen this flag than the other flag that was up in Sonoma. Now for documentation, I don't have time to go into all of the written documentation. I will say that for years I saw all of these different references to a flag that I kind of put together in my mind. It says, it looks like you're talking about the same flag, and this is kind of what it looked like. Now I made this this illustration of what I thought the flag would look like before I even knew it was still in existence. And part of what I got on that was from this, which is from 1920 or 1930. That this flag this book by Edmund T. Olson, who was a very well-known historian at that time, showed this illustration indicating that flag had been flown in the window of ZCMI for the 100th anniversary of the church in 1930. So that tells a little bit of the story and is part of the documentation too. In 2000, after I learned that the flag did still exist and was in the hands of Elder G. Smith, the Patriarch Emeritus of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I made arrangements to go out and visit with Elder Smith out of first in his office, and he forgot to bring the flag with him. And so then we went out to his home that evening, and I saw the lifeguard bear flag for the first time, and made this measured drawing of it at that time. And at that time, Elder had told us this story, which I documented in my report. It's also documented by some other physical things. Here's an interesting belt buckle that Ron Fox found in the collection of the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers in their museum. And this was a belt buckle that dates back to about 1860, and it belonged to Heber Young, the son of Brigham Young. And as you can see, it has a bear on it that looks very much like our bear on the lifeguard flag. Now, written documentation, there's quite a bit, and I don't have time to go over all of these different references. Some of them, people will say, well, that's kind of, we can't tell for sure. Well, that's the way it is with documentation very often. But these are all items that could, and some of them very strongly, could refer to this particular flag. Now, if we look at the existing artifact, that's probably one of the greatest documentations for this flag. Looking at artifacts or flags, to give you an idea of how they can be understood, this flag is called the Ottinger flag, and is carried here by a fireman who received it from Ottinger, and it was displayed in Ottinger Hall for many years and is now up at this is the place in Pioneerville, or Old Deseret there, in Ottinger Hall. When I checked this flag out, and it's framed and hangs in that hall, I've noted some things that people hadn't noted before. It has now the length up to that dotted line, and the rest of the flag is gone. But when you look at the middle red stripe, you can see the pinholes, the needle holes for lettering that was appliqued there originally that reads 3rd Regiment of Infantry Nauvoo Legion. Now, Ottinger was many things. He was an artist, he was a fireman, and he was also an officer in the Nauvoo Legion. He was one of the men arrested during the Wooden Gun Rebellion. So is this the flag of the Wooden Gun Rebellion? It may be, it'd be hard to prove, but it definitely is more than people knew up in Pioneer Village. So I got together with folks at the Church History Library and Archives and found originally a photograph of the flag that was taken with a press camera. And it was a good image, but talking to Michael DeGroot of the Deseret News, we decided that with modern digital photography, a better image could be obtained. And so with the help of the Church History Department, including Brad here, who was director of the collection at that time, we were able to have the flag photographed by a very high resolution camera. And so for the first time, we were able to examine the flag not only in person, but with this photograph. And as we did that, Michael DeGroot, again checking it over, noted that there was something unusual. You can see it just barely. Here is a platform, and underneath the eagle is a beehive. And nobody had noted that before. Now, I was very upset when I saw that at first, because I thought, oh my goodness, that would date it to Utah, but I don't think they used the beehive in Illinois. And I was worried about that for many years. And then I read an article by Susan Easton Black, and she indicated that yes, indeed, the beehive was used in Nauvoo. And she gave several reasons for it, and I checked them back. At first I was a little reluctant. I thought, well, maybe she's pushing it. But you see, in the earlier part of that century, up in New England and in the areas around there was a movement by, I can't think of his name now, a British reform individual, and he had the beehive as his symbol, and so the beehive was well known as a symbol in Britain and in New England in the early days of the church. Now, one of the individuals who joined the church up in Kirtland was a man named Peter Hawes. Peter Hawes we know little about today because after he came to Utah in 1849, he got into a hassle with the brethren and was excommunicated and left the area. But in Nauvoo, he was a very influential man. He was one of the individuals in charge of the Nauvoo House building effort and also of the Nauvoo Agricultural and Manufacturing Association. And the Nauvoo Agricultural and Manufacturing Association issued stock certificates with the beehive, and he was involved at that time. He was also a minter and did a lot of even counterfeit coins. But out on the plains, he amended this beehive coin, which has baffled people for years, but again with the beehive. So it's not at all unusual to think that Peter Hawes was very instrumental in the beehive being used in the early days. Then in 2013, the North American Vexillological Association met here in Salt Lake, and again with Brad's help, we put together a charrette, or an examination of the flag by some experts. And I brought in, there's James Farragon III, who is the curator of the largest American flag collection in the world, been very knowledgeable. And then Gwen Pfizer, one of the most gifted flag restorers, and then from what's her name? Katie Smith from the Church History Department. And the flag was examined, and Katie took these infrared photographs, and the results, Jim Farragon gave those results for the flag, that there's nothing about the flag that would indicate that it is not of that period. My conclusion is that it is not only the flag. Very strongly, it's no question the flag of the lifeguard of the Utah militias dating back to 1850, and that it is also the most likely the flag taken by the Mormon Battalion to California. And there's strong evidence for all of this. In all of this, there is nothing at all to disprove it. The family story fits in with the history that is known, and it is a stronger provenance both of the chain of the physical flag being handed down and of the story than for many, many flags that are accepted without question. And I've examined many flags, and I've debunked many that I felt were not adequately proved. But this one is definitely I would say, as I said at the beginning, It is the most important flag artifact in the long view of Utah history. So thank you very much.
I'm going to tell you about my graduate project, Metal Storytellers, Reflections of War Culture in Sulverplate B29 Nose Art from the 509th Composite Group. Ordinary men tasked with an extraordinary mission that ended World War II. And most people are familiar with the Enola Gay, the B-29 that dropped the little boy, the first atomic bomb over the city of Hiroshima, Japan on August 6th of 1945. But less known are the other 14 Sulverplate B-29 airplanes that trained for the mission, were named and later adorned with nose art. However, in recorded history, the atomic missions overshadowed the occupational folklore of this group. Because of the abundance of planes that were scrapped after the war, and most World War II veterans have passed on, all that remains of this occupational group are in photographs, oral and written histories, some books, and 2 iconic airplanes in museum exhibits. Yet the public's fascination and curiosity with nose art keeps the tradition alive. Throughout my research, I found 3 heavily repeated sources of cultural data from the 509th Composite Group: the sign at the front of Windover, Army Airfield, the top secret training environment that they endured, and a poem called Nobody Knows. Professor Joe Fox from the Institute of Historical Research claims that war art tends to reproduce recognized visual codes through color, style, texture, theme, and choice of subject. Such codes have particular importance for propaganda. I always struggle on that word. Propaganda. You all know what I'm trying to say. Since they signify potential points of connection with the audience through pre-existing beliefs, values, and ideologies that might be summoned to underscore the message or viewpoint. The purpose of my graduate project and internship with the Hill Aerospace Museum was, it's still ongoing, is to collaborate on a World War II nose art exhibit that analyzes the humanizing aspects of the Sulverplate B-29 nose art from the 509th Composite Group, and show how nose art was a mechanism that bonded a crew, often through everyday items from their previous life, and helped them rebel against conformity, rules, cope with death and destruction, all while maintaining a sense of themselves. So the Hill Aerospace Museum asked me to research the stories behind the 15 Sulverplate B-29 nose art images, and I began my graduate project using qualitative methods. Historical accounts of the 509th Composite Group, followed by oral and written histories, memorabilia, and conversations with descendants to clarify some of the events. Then I used academic research in folklore, anthropology, history, military history, art history, cultural studies, and media studies to search for explanations or theories behind the actions and events. Exploring museums brought the airmen's story to life for me, and I immersed myself in learning about this group when I visited historic Windover Airfield, Los Alamos, and I sat bombardier on a 30-minute flight in Dock, which is one of only 2 B-29s flying in the world. The crew took me out over Lake Winnebago in Wisconsin. I was at Oshkosh at the time, the big Oshkosh Air Show, to simulate what a water approach would feel like flying into Japan or returning to Tinian. And I concluded that nose art was not trivial images of pinup women or cartoon characters, but folklore. Informal, meaning that it was unauthorized, and traditional, meaning that it was passed on. Pieces of expressive culture that was transmitted on fuselages of planes and humanized the men of the 509. So part of understanding nose art is to learn the background context. Dan Benamos claimed there are contextual conventions that set folklore apart. These are specifications as to time, place, and company in which the folklore actions happen. So let me take you back to the year of 1944. General Dwight D. Eisenhower takes over command of the U.S. forces in the European Theater of Operations. Plans were underway for Operation Overlord, codename for the Battle of Normandy and now commonly known as D-Day. In the Pacific, the U.S. Marines were invading the Mariana Islands, and later in August, the Navy Seabees will begin the miracle of construction, in which they transformed the island of Tinian into the world's largest airbase to accommodate the U.S.'s newest very heavy bombers. Back in the United States, the early B-29s rolled off the assembly line and were modified during the Battle of Kansas and designated for the Pacific Theater of Operations. And Colonel Paul W. Tibbets was selected to lead the 509th Composite Group, the first Army Air Force group that was organized, equipped, and trained for atomic warfare. The code word Sulverplate was established to help Colonel Tibbets acquire whatever was needed to conduct the mission. In a newspaper article many years later, he said, "Nobody in the future will ever be given the responsibility and authority that I was given as a 29-year-old man. Today, 4-star generals have less authority than I had then." Wendover Army Airfield was selected for their top secret training due to its remote location, and on September 14th, the 393rd Bomb Squadron moved to Wendover Field, and then the 509th Composite Group was activated at Wendover on December 17th. So Colonel Tibbets started by hand-picking 15 bomber crews that he later said it took every man of the 509th to put those airplanes into the air. Each not just a select few played a part and should be recognized for their individual part. So the group moved to Wendover. Like I said, it was chosen for its remote location near the salt flats, and because of the nearby rural town, he thought the men were less likely to get in trouble there. And the sign at the entrance of the base was the first clue that something was going on. Colonel Tibbets gathered the men together and revealed that they were in a top secret program for the government, and it would help end the war possibly by up to a year. He forbid them from talking about the job and discussing it among themselves with their family. FBI agents were always watching them. They followed them around Wendover, they followed them home on leave, and even up into Salt Lake City. They posed as the clerks in the hotels or wherever the men might be visiting. Members were here one day and gone the next for violating orders, getting drunk and talking too much, or for giving a tour of their B-29. So let's take a moment to think about if you were in the 509 and you were in this environment where you couldn't even talk to your coworkers. How would you feel about that? So go ahead, and as they mentioned earlier, to introduce yourself to your neighbor, go ahead and take a moment and discuss what would this feel like to be in this environment. Okay, well actually this was a test, so you have to stop talking because this is what the 509s endured. So that was actually just a test to see if you'd be able to keep a secret. So how do you express your emotions when you have no one to talk to? You turn to art. So James Payne said that everyone has a story, and although there were 15 planes, I only have time to tell you the intimate details of maybe 5 or 6, hopefully I can at least get through that many, and how the names and the nose art functions for the crews that flew them. First, the nose art was a canvas to express their emotions regarding their training and ending the war. Second, the nose art framed the airmen's experience and created an identity for the crews. And last, after the war, the men reframed their war experiences by transitioning the art from the plane to their storytelling performances. So let me get started with the first point. So nose art was a canvas for expressive culture. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of nose art. World War II ignited the phenomenon known as the golden years of aircraft nose art. Airmen painted their planes to protest the structured world that they lived in and take back some of the control that they lost during the war. The military drafted them into service. They told them, under the threat of punishment or hazing, how to cut their hair, what to wear, what job they were going to do, where they were going to live, and censored what they could and could not talk about. And within a conformed unit, the airmen lost their personal identity and gained a new group identity. During their transformation, the men were exposed to visual culture like pinups, cartoon strips, card games, which they took all this information and they stored it in an inventory that they were going to use later on airplanes. After training, the airmen were assigned together, building a crew, and the crew was assigned to a specific aircraft, entering them into a relationship that continued throughout the war. Very much unlike now, where you just go out to whatever plane is available. They actually got to stay with their plane. The more time the airmen spent in the plane, the more human-like the planes became to the crew. After the war, T.G.H. Ward studied the relationship between pilots and their planes, and his 1951 article for the British Journal of Medical Psychology concluded that when a machine becomes as complicated as an aircraft, with an engine that emits a particular sound, has a particular feel and characteristics, and usually a certain amount of beauty, it tends to be regarded as a living creature having a personality and sometimes even feeling of its own. And this curious animism results in a relationship developing between man and machine, which in ways is similar to relationships that develop between one human being and another human being. So airmen needed a distraction from the death and destruction that was occurring around them, not just in the war zone, but also during training. Training was very dangerous in some of these new planes, and the training that they had was limited, and they were new pilots. So they participated in this ritual of naming their airplanes and creating unauthorized visual rhetoric on the fuselage, along with the other authorized aircraft insignia. Nose art boosted morale, so the practice was encouraged. Although some of the 509th crews named their planes prior to the first atomic mission, the group was actually banned from applying nose art to avoid detection. And so naming an airplane adopted it into their military family that the crews had formed, but they weren't able to actually add those images to personify it, to fully personify it. Traditionally, the pilot had the ultimate decision on the name, but most of the time it was a group decision, and the entire crew had to agree on the name. Since the 509th used their training, some of the 509th used their training environment, maybe a characteristic of the men in their crew or the type of mission that they flew as inspiration for their names. And after the first atomic mission, the men were finally allowed to participate in the nose art ritual and publicly claim their role in ending the war and boost the morale among themselves of being worn down from the environment that they were training in, with the exception of the Enola Gay was actually painted late in the afternoon on August 5th, the day before the mission. Adding the artwork personified the names, and they established their identity among all of the other B-29s on the flight line, and they also became more memorable as news got back to the United States, and the planes took on a role of their own as the media picked up the stories of the atomic mission and what had happened, as well as the planes that had been flying throughout all the war. Something else to keep in mind, that America in the 1940s was known for its wholesome values, and they did not publicly talk about violence and sex, and the graphic messages in the form of cartoon characters and pinup girls were meant to shock audiences on both sides of the world. And they may be considered what I call some of the early forms of worldwide memes, transmitting expressive culture as the planes flew across the globe. So combining the horrors of war with these familiar references to pop culture increased the audience's recognition to the symbols and showed what was important to the group at the time. And so even though the countries at war spoke different languages, the images translated between the different cultures. Another interesting thing to point out, that the tail numbers were all different on the 15 Sulverplate B-29s because after Tokyo Rose had welcomed the 509th Titinian, Colonel Tibbets changed the black arrow tail designators that they came with, which were the only official marking, and then he rearranged them so that they would fit in with the other bomber groups and that they wouldn't stand out and give away what they were training for. So that it became official and unofficial markings on planes. So let me tell you about one of the first planes. So this is top secret. There's numerous memoirs from the 509th that described the top secret environment and the sign that I showed you a few slides ago at the beginning of the base. What you see here, what you hear here, what you see here, and when you leave here, let it stay here. In an interview over 71 years later, Jack Wadowski, who was the navigator for Crew B8, claimed that he was the one that had named the plane, and he showed that he could still keep a secret because he refused to explain what the highlighted T and S meant. His inspiration may have started from the top secret training environment, but an injury that occurred during a training mission finalized his choice. Numerous other crew members recounted the same incident in their memoirs. It occurred in the spring of 1945. Crew B8 was on a training mission from Wendover to Los Angeles to San Francisco. And about at 3,100 feet over San Francisco, the co-pilot had called Wadowski up to the cockpit to look at the bright lights over Alcatraz. And so he crawled through the tunnel, and he reached the front of the plane in an instant before a turret cover blew open. And so part of the Sulverplate B-29s was the modifications, and one of the ways to make it lighter to carry the 10,000-pound bomb was to remove the turrets. And so there was just like a metal covering where the turret had been. So it blew off, opening a hole in the floor. A lot of their supplies fell out, and there was multiple newspaper articles that commented on what the Air Force was doing, between dropping meatballs from their dinner to unloading their parachutes and different types of training. But it also caused this decompression explosion. And Wadowski had left his navigation equipment, possibly his Norden bomb sight, in the tunnel, which flew forward and hit him on the head. And as his crew said, it knocked him cuckoo. He was bleeding all over the plane as he returned through the tunnel to his seat. The pilots were able to land the plane, but because it was top secret, no one could board the plane. And it caused quite a stir at the airport. And so while an ambulance took Wadowski to the hospital to stitch up his wound, other crew members were driving all over base, because this is the middle of the night, trying to find a sergeant that had the special orders for dealing with top secret planes like theirs, because they had to be brought over to a different side of the base. And people are wanting to come onto the airplane, and they're having to protect their plane and not allow anybody to come on. So it was quite a commotion. They were, at one time, they were pulled over by a police officer who let them go after seeing that they were covered in Wadowski's blood, and that there was an emergency that was going on. And so a short time later, on June 6th of 1945, the crew left Wendover for Tinian in a brand new Sulverplate B-29 that they called Top Secret. All right, the next plane that I want to tell you about is Straight Flush. And the obvious interpretation of Straight Flush is that playing cards occupied and distracted the men's minds during downtime. Gambling was a favorite pastime of the 509th, both at Wendover and at Tinian, and especially for the crew of Straight Flush. A straight flush is the best hand in poker, containing 5 cards of the same suit and sequential, can't say that word either, rank unless you're playing with jokers. Military members were given spotter cards to identify enemy aircraft and ships, and these cards were small, so they were small, lightweight, and they could easily be stuffed in a pocket or duffel bag when the men were on the move. Yet, if you look at the image closely, there are no gambling symbols in this nose art. So Franklin K. Way, bombardier for Crew C-11, remembered, "As for naming the straight flush, I recall that the painter had drawn a number of pictures, and since Buck and I played a lot of poker, he offered the name to us. The straight flush crew was recognized as the most unmilitary crew in the 509th. We tended strictly to business when on duty, but off duty we saw to it that our enlisted men were taken care of, airmen and ground crew alike. We were all the best of friends." And so note, if you look at their names, the aircraft commander, pilot, and bombardier were named Etherly, Weatherly, and Way. And stories about the trio, stories about them said they were quite a trio. The flight engineer described one of their shenanigans in Wendover. And he said that they had been flying on autopilot because they were playing cards in the cockpit, and they got in an argument over a map, and somebody happened to look out the window and realize that they were about 10 feet off the ground. So as he pulled up to get the plane to get some altitude, he actually hit the tail on the salt flats. And when they got back to Wendover, Etherly was yelling at the crew to quickly wipe off the evidence so that Tibbets wouldn't come and yell at them. Nose art can be read like political cartoons. Things to look for would be the symbolism, exaggeration, labeling, etc. And I know that I'm almost out of time, so I wanted to point out that it's important to look at nose art with eyes from 1944, because when we look at it from 2019, it looks very politically incorrect. And so again, putting things in context of what they were going through and what some of these symbols stand for, like you can barely see Uncle Sam's sleeve that stands for America. And instead of flushing him through the toilet, the motion of the letters shows that he's actually getting a swirly, which is meant to harass them. I am going to go on quickly and let you know that although many people think that pinups were the majority of nose art during World War II, they were actually only about just over 50-55%. And within the 509th group, that male, like nose art with male connotation, actually made up 40% of their nose art, which was actually pretty high. Usually the male nose art was some type of cartoon character that was more aggressive acting, and the females took on different roles, which I was hoping that I would get to tell you. Let me see if there's anything else. Let's see. Let me move quickly to the Up and Atom really quick, because I want to tell you about the 3 roles that nose art could take on. And so the first role is that when they're doing their flight planning and getting ready to take off, the nose art acts as a talisman. It's a good luck charm. George Marquardt, who was the aircraft commander of Up and Atom, said that he used to reach out the window and rub parts of her body to give them good luck. Once they were up in the air, the nose art transitioned into a guardian angel, and she was meant to protect them. They called upon her power, very similar to the power that you see that women have in Greek mythology. They called upon that to protect them so that they would be able to return safely back to the base. And then once they arrived at the base, and in particular at Tinian, where the other unmodified B-29s were very dangerous, had a very bad reputation. I believe they fell right underneath the Widowmakers as far as the rates of incidences and accidents. Once the plane was parked, the nose art became a surrogate mourner, which was a female stock symbol that would stand watch as the plane was parked on the hard stand and watch out over all the other accidents and things that were taking place and mourn the losses for them, because in that military environment you weren't allowed to show that you were weak and mourn your losses. So after the war, like I said earlier, the atomic missions overshadowed the actual men that flew the missions. And you don't really know about any of their names except for the crew of the Enola Gay, maybe the crew of Boxcar. But this was a poem that was written while they were on Tinian, and it was meant to razz them. And they finally, once the news came out about what had happened, they finally felt vindicated that we were actually training for something, that we weren't being lazy when everybody else wasn't flying. And they were able to then talk about their stories. They were able to claim their role in ending World War II. As they continued to perform these stories to friends, to families, at speaking engagements, they started to put the nose art, the planes took on the names even before they were named, and they would talk about the planes back in certain points in history as if they had already been named and adorned with their nose art. As sort of reframing their history. There's only 2 original planes left from the 509th Composite Group, Enola Gay and Boxcar, both in museums, and then there are 2 replica nose art. And I am way out of time, so I am going to move on and save my questions for the end. So, it's yours.
Hi, I'm Anali Rappleye, and I am a records analyst at the Division of State History, and today my presentation is on the scenic route, the historic filming locations of Utah. So this is our project overview. The Film Commission came to us to create a data set of movie locations around the state. So the Utah Film Commission gave us a list of over 900 movies and television series. So in order to narrow this list down so that it was a little bit more workable for us in our time, we decided to only focus on major films. And so we mapped about 570 movies. So for our sources, along with a list from the Film Commission. We did use the book When Hollywood Came to Town by James Dark. Also, I used a lot of internet sources. I definitely used IMDb, a ton of Google, and then I also used Google Earth to help pinpoint our locations. And then another thing that we were running into was a lot of the locations were very general. We were given these really lists of Moab, Seminole County, just like really general, and we really wanted to kind of narrow it down and be more specific. So I leveraged several digital streaming services to access the movies and observe the backgrounds, which was YouTube, Amazon, Hulu, Netflix, and they were very helpful. You might think, oh, who are you? You had to watch movies and get paid for it. And you probably thought that I was watching like these kinds of movies, like Indiana Jones. But actually, this is what I was watching the most, was Snow Beast and other ridiculous movies. Out of the 570, I actually watched about 450 to find these locations, which kind of ruined movies for me a little bit for a while because I was always focusing on the background and not on the story of what was happening. And so these are our final products that we came up with. We made these story maps and other maps for Maps on the Hill with the data. These are the story maps right here. Whoops. Right here. And you can find these right here online at the heritage.utah.gov. You'll be able to find these story maps and go through them. So these are my methods, like how specifically was I able to do this? I would find a spot in the film that I could try and recognize. Like this mountain range, this ski lift. I have a coworker that skis, and so I worked with him to kind of figure out where was this lift at. And then I was able to narrow it down to Brighton Ski Resort, because this lift right here is this lift right here. And then I would just get in closer, and then you can see the back of the fencing is right here. And then I would place a point, get the longitude and latitude points, and then I sent that on to our GIS specialist. And then we would put in a point like this, where the location was at. And a lot of times, like I had said, we had general ones, and there's just, look at all these movies for that one point. So sometimes it's just one movie, and a lot of other times for that point, it's a whole list of movies. So then we were able to, with all of this plot stuff, we were able to find trends over time. I want to point out Westerns first. So Utah, from 1913 to 1959, we can see that there was quite a strong trend that definitely tanks by the 1980s. But you can also see that interest in other films starts to go up. We have comedy, horror, drama, and action. Those were just kind of the main lists we have. The other thing that we were able to find is that not only can the genre trend be seen, but we can physically see this with the genre, the change of location. So Westerns started down here in the south, in southern Utah, and then it just starts to take this north easterly change. And now, like, a lot of movies, more of them are filmed up here in Salt Lake area, West Desert. And those are actually more of the horror films, a lot of the mining areas and towns where they're filmed at. So this brings me to film and archaeology. What can I do with this data as it pertains to archaeology? One thing that it does is it can synthesize what we know about a place, and about set building in Utah. It also can facilitate documenting sites. This can help us gain a greater context of a space, and is especially helpful when there's a place where a building no longer exists. It can give us a little bit more information. And it also can bring us to engage the public in archaeology and in preservation. So I narrowed it down to two kinds of sets that we can see for film. One of them here on the left is sets that they had built for the film and then abandoned them. And this one right here on the left is they came to Cordura. And then we have the ones on the right, which are from historic districts. They were already built, they were already there. They were either fell out of use, abandoned completely. This is the Olmsted power plant. This was used as the hospital in Halloween 5. So here's a type of site that was a set that was built for movies. This is the Kanab Movie Fort. It was really popular in set building at the time. Kind of starting in 1953, we have Fort Bowie, and then we have a lot of other westerns, and you can tell, especially these early westerns, between the 50s and the 60s, this fort is really popular. You start to notice it the more you watch these films. And then we end with the Apple Dumpling Gang rides again, because
now the big screen explodes. I said, the big screen explodes. With the legend of the funniest fugitives ever caught on film.
So they were supposed to build a separate set for this explosion. Well, that set exploded and then exploded the real set. And it is now out of use. So this is on private land. So it would be kind of cool if we could work with the owner of that land and try to come up with some preservation help with that to see if we could gain some interest there for them. The other thing are, in archaeology we have some recorded sites. This is where the archaeologists went out, they were looking for something else, and they stumbled across these sites. This one is for Westwood the women. What they did here is they actually built a road. And back then, because they were trying to do all of these really organic Western, out in the wild shots, they had to get there. And so originally it was a rancher that had taken them to these spots, but they needed to make the roads for them. And this is in the Coxcomb region of Paria, and you can see that a lot of these specifically Westerns were filmed there. And this one also shares Highway 89 with it down there in Kanab area. This other one is around Cordura. This one is the town of Harrisburg. The archaeologists had gone out, they were surveying something else, they came across a Mexican hacienda and a well, and they couldn't figure out why it was there, because across the street is the pioneer settlement of Harrisburg, which is abandoned. And it was way out of place, way out of context. But when they got closer, they could see the chicken wire in the wall of the hacienda and started to realize that it actually was a filming set. And this is what's left, this wall right here, which is part of this part right here. The story behind why there's not much of this wall left is because the director didn't care, and when they were done filming, he told everybody working the crew that they could go and take a piece of the set, which freaks out my archaeology heart. Don't touch it. You can look, but you don't pick it up. This is another site where they went out and they have this rock art that doesn't appear to be the rock art from Utah. And so one of the stories that was from one of the local residents was that this actually was for a film set, but we don't know which film this is for. So there's a lot of future investigation that could go into this to really find out if this really actually was for a film or if some kids or somebody got bored. See, like these aren't, that right there especially, we don't know what that is. So that brings me to Saltaire, which is my favorite, one of the favorites in our office. This obviously is legendary in Utah. So the first Saltaire 1 was 1893 to 1925, and it burned down. This is also a great example of what we can use film to understand something that was once there and is no longer able to be seen at all. It can give us that more moving kind of reality than just a photograph. And then our next one is Saltaire 2. This is 1926 to 1970. Some films filmed there was the Desert Empire documentary in '48, Carnival of Souls, which is one of the most popular ones, in 1962. And Carnival of Souls really was kind of one of the last films to really capture what it looked like before it burned down. And then we have the giant brine shrimp, which is a steal of a movie. You can find it on YouTube, and you should. They used the news video in it to show when it was burning, like when the news crew went out. So it's a really fun movie done by, it was a student film at BYU. So this legend of the second one, it didn't do well. It had flooding, we had the Great Depression, we had war and arson twice, and then eventually after the second time they just let it go because it no longer had a significance at the time. And this is Carnival of Souls. And you can see they didn't really have to do much to it to make it look scary. So then they moved Saltaire to where it is now, and they rebuilt it a mile and a half southwest of where Saltaire 2 was. And this is built from an aircraft hangar. It's 1981 to present. This is used as a concert venue. It's known as being cursed. It's had flooding. It had kind of an aquatic park at first, but they just couldn't quite get it to go. And then abandoned for the aquatic part for just specifically concert venue. And this is Saltaire 2 now. So what we can see is this right here, which was the aqueduct, thank you. That was the aqueduct that went from there out to the water, and they pumped the water back. I don't know. I'll be honest, I don't know. I just know what it is. And then this is just kind of looking out. So you kind of wouldn't know what you're looking at first when you're there if you didn't know the history of it before you had gotten there. Unfortunately, we don't have, at the time, it didn't have good site stewardship, and there's quite an absence. And aside from the people in our office who just enjoy going out there to help preserve it, it still falls to looters. And it is not legal to go out there and dig and take things. I wish I had the updated one, because like 6 months ago somebody had gone out and there was like a 30 by 30 pit dug and things probably taken. So it's really unfortunate, because when you're taking items away from the site, you're losing your full story. There's things that they were finding. We can see these bottles, ceramics, and that helps us understand. And then we can see right here there are liquor bottles, which kind of lets us know Saltaire was built by the Mormons at the time, and so to see that there is this alcohol kind of element to it helps us know there's a different or a deeper story there than what we generally know about it. And then for my conclusion, especially with Saltaire, with the synthesizing data, it really helps us gather a full information of what was in the area and identifying that context as well. And then with public engagement, like Saltaire, we can connect to a place and help the public to engage and feel like some kind of ownership to what they're seeing makes them feel more ownership than the items that are there. That it's public, they can have it. It's more, this is something we all share. We've all seen this movie, we all share and care about this site, and so we can have better site preservation and stewardship. And just want to acknowledge my coworkers and the Utah Film Commission, the book by James Stark, and a special thanks to the World Wide Web. Thank you.
I think the three presenters today were exceptional, and I'd like to ask you all to do another round of applause. I just have a few comments I'd want to make related to these presentations. First, John's, the lifeguard bear flag. This has been an ongoing concern for many people, including conservators and flag specialists and historians. I think what we can say definitely is that we have an incredible 19th century artifact in our hands. It is large, it has been used by multiple people, be it contested, it still is perhaps Utah's most remarkable and I think valuable flag. I think it tells as much about us today as it did each time it was used. If it were used in Illinois, I think personally, having worked with in that charrette that John mentioned, it certainly is compelling. But I do know that it was we can definitely date it to early Utah, and I think the story of California is also very strong. And I welcome John's continual work, and I hope that this artifact will eventually join, if I may be so bold, the artifacts owned by the state of Utah. It is owned by the Smith family, Gary Smith, and what makes it kind of mysterious and interesting is it was included with the clothes of Hiram Smith at the time of his death. Various other family artifacts that were retained with that kind of storied, mystical story or idea of things being turned over from one generation to the next. And of course, for Mormons, the Book of Mormon has the title of liberty, and we have this conflict with the federal government and our statehood. And so to me, this flag is just embedded with interesting storied history kind of aspects of it. So I encourage John to continue. I was fascinated by Terri's so much of the art that I have seen has been more risque appearing and women, and I just love the rigor of all three of these presenters, particularly Terri, and all the different aspects of material culture and history and archaeology and folklore, and just using all these different methodologies to intersect and really pierce into the subject matter. And I hope this will eventually be published, Terri. I think to me, with the Wendover Army Airfield, we have such a big nuclear era story here in Utah. And then, of course, the Topaz internment camp in Delta. I think there's so much the public needs to know more about the military installations, such a big part of Utah's economy. So, and I love the idea of linking up with memes and graphic culture in the international world. It just really seems like something that needs to be better known to the general public. Finally, Anali, I'm fascinated by all the ways that GIS mapping can help history. It's a powerful means of placing stories in geographical context, but it also pushes people out of museums. Now, you'd think someone who's trying to build a museum for Utah's history wouldn't say that, but really the point of any modern contemporary interaction with history has to be with sites and locations and monuments and markers and interacting with topography, and that's what these maps do. And so I applaud the archaeology division in state history for doing this. I also think it's quite fascinating how artifice interacts with history, how Utah has been used so often that people will actually confuse actual historical sites and artifacts with those made by film. I finally think that the landscape of Utah since the 1920s, for good or ill, is the expression or the idea of the American West. When I've traveled across Europe and in South America and elsewhere, people always look at those forlorn Monument Valley and other kind of almost semi-arid sites as the way of understanding the West. And I think that's a great legacy for Utah, to own and have these sites. So all three of these exceptional presentations, and I just grateful that I could be able to make comment about them. And now let's take questions from the audience for our speakers. Gary Smith.
John, what explanation could there be for painting over the beehive with an eagle?
Okay. Of course, I didn't have sufficient time to go into all of the details, so thank you for bringing that up. After when the battalion went to California, the flag was with them, and the beehive would have been a symbol of that particular unit when they went down. But when they came back, and it was part of the Nauvoo Legion, the name for the Utah Territorial Militia, there was a real interest in kind of, if you will, sucking up to the federal government, saying, yeah, we're part of the federal government's effort here under the territory. And so the eagle at that point would have been painted over the beehive in order to show that they were part of the territory of Utah and saying, hey, U.S. government, we're part of you. So that's, I think, one of the items that is a part of the documentation of the flag itself that lends to its credibility.
John, comment, if you will, on the flag depicted in that painting by George Ottinger. It shows far too many stars, in my opinion. I'm not even sure what that flag is. This is the Mormon Battalion at Carrizo Creek.
Well, actually, I don't know. I've not been able to determine for sure that they carried an actual Stars and Stripes with them that would have been displayed during the march. They likely had flags with them, and certainly when they got to California, the Navy was already there, and there were probably the flag that was raised in Los Angeles was one that was obtained locally. But during the Mexican-American War, many different flags were used, but that particular flag that Ottinger showed would have been just his idea. As a matter of fact, very often flags had less stars rather than more. Many flags from the Mexican War showed 13 stars only. When you're putting stars on flags, it's a lot of work for every star you put on. So very often they would go less rather than more. I have heard that some flags without stars were issued at Fort Leavenworth when the battalion left, and they gave them a flag with a plain blue canton and then a pot of paint and a brush. Go paint your own stars. Because during the period of the march and of the original colonization of Utah, we were adding stars to the flag every year.
Other questions?
For Anali,
could you stand up, please?
Sure. The question is about, you did a lot of research online. Did you have to do any site visits?
I didn't do the site visits. I just took what we had in the office and what we had available just online. I do intend to go do site visits, just especially for the sites that have been recorded, just to go back and see what's still left. some of these sites, like the one that has the wall, is protected by a conservancy group there. It's by a hiking trail, so they do protect it. But there's a lot of places that do need stewardship and could really have that. So I look forward to going out and continuing to update the database for it. So thank you.
Anali, I'm going to steal a question for you. A fellow who was a filmmaker at BYU, Whitaker, can't think of his first name, nickname, but Whitaker used lots of Utah scenes for making big films that were distributed across the entire, international church. Are any of those films included in the BYU produced films in the 60s and 70s?
There might be some on the list. I know that when we did the Christmas story map, or the winter movies one, we have some of the ones that were filmed here that BYU might have been involved with, and or the church might have been involved with.
The reason I say that is because I don't know about any of you who've seen some films that have Utah in the backdrop. I'm stunned how different things are, how quickly these become period documents that frame up, say, Lehi in the 1980s or early 90s, so different than it is today. Thank you. Let me have, there's one over here that had a hand raised, and now I'll get you, sir. You would stand, please.
There's a correlation between, being able to visit these sites and exploiting those sites. So by putting them actually on the map, you're encouraging exploitation. Is there anything that sometimes you just want to hold back, that you don't want everyone to know where it is and how to find it?
That's a really good question. We can liken this to things like rock art. We always worry about looting, destruction, but that impact of people going to a place and raising the foot traffic will also raise the probability of looting and destruction. But one way that we can counteract that is by getting people involved this is why I keep saying stewardship, because it does take a group of people to care about a place, and if they care about a place, then they'll take care of a place. And they'll encourage others to care for the place. And I don't see it as exploitation as much as learning and education. It's a tool that we can use in archaeology. It's a tool that we can use in history as well. People are going to find things no matter what, especially because places are so available. But we just, are careful about how we tell people about it, I would say.
Yes.
I have a question for you also.
Would you stand so they can hear you?
Is there a certain protocol, I'd say, when people are scouting for locations to film, that they have a research project they're working on, their, historical or whatever else, and they kind of think, well, certain things fit with this movie. The thing I'm kind of curious about is there a protocol, obviously when you come knock on somebody's door, that's a little intimidating for that person, because of course they don't know who you are, they don't know who you're representing. But is there kind of a, if you have a potential area or a site even that you kind of picked out in your mind as a future filmmaker or whatever else, is there a protocol for, talking to people that live there, the owners of the property? Is there something that you have to go through prior to actually making contact with that person? I mean, you have to go to a state agency or a city agency and say, okay, there's this thing over here, I want to see it. Where can I get permission to, make everything happen?
Anali, will you pick up the microphone?
Is it working?
I think so.
Okay. Thank you for your question. There is a process, especially when it comes to public lands, federal, state lands, city properties, that they have to get a permit to film. And part of that is making sure that archaeology can be protected. Areas can be protected, so they go survey those, especially on public land. If they're filming in the city, they've got to get a permit with the city and get those permissions. But there are processes.
Is there kind of a protocol from one step to another? I mean, you have a business contact or something you can talk to initially.
I don't know how to answer that outside of permitting for filming on public lands. The best way I can answer it, to my knowledge, would be the process for getting a permit to film on public lands, especially when there are sites. So
you go to the city, you go to the county, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd have to go through each agency to get those permissions.
Let's have some other questions.
Thank you.
Gary.
Terry, I know your work was with nose art for planes, but was there a similar kind of thing with land vehicles, military vehicles, or even the old Kilroy was here, which I remember myself during World War II, that I saw everywhere.
It's interesting that you brought up Kilroy, because that's actually one of my favorite planes, Luke the Spook, because of that story, where Luke the Spook was one of the last of the Sulverplate planes to go over. Some of them had stayed behind to take over components of the atomic bombs, and so they didn't land until the end of July, early August of 45. And Luke the Spook pretty much did a quick turnaround because the United States was unsure of what was going to be the results of this, and they were preparing for a third bomb. And it was actually necessary evil that had been selected to carry it and drop it. And so Luke the Spook was one of the ones that had been tasked to go back to the United States and to hang out at Windover to see if this was going to happen. Once the war ended, then Luke the Spook remained behind. There was another plane, Jabbit 3. Jabbit 3 was actually destroyed in Chicago in September, and so Luke the Spook was basically the only other of the 15 Sulverplate B-29s. There were over 100 that were in all modified, but in this phase 3. So Luke the Spook is hanging out, and then as the 509th is coming back and returning from Tinian, they move the 509th from Windover to Roswell, New Mexico. And so Luke the Spook is one of the first planes. I'm assuming that this is maybe how Luke the Spook got its, I'm not sure where the Luke comes from, but the image is Kilroy. And so that Luke the Spook got to Roswell first before the other members of the 509th returned from Tinian. Because that's the legend of Kilroy, is that somebody had always gotten there before you and was able to put Kilroy in. I was able to research the legend of Kilroy and where they think the origins came from.
What are they?
So there was a contest that was held, I believe it was shortly after World War II, and the most credible source that they were able to find came from somebody with the last name of Kilroy, and I apologize without my notes in front of me, but that he worked in a factory and he would mark because they got paid a certain way, and so he would have to write on it, and he started to write Kilroy was here, basically saying that he had inspected this and had written off on it. And it was in a location where there was a lot of soldiers that were being deployed and would see this image and then would take it with them, and then it just spread as folklore does. And so
Terry, thank you. We have time for one more question. Any comments? Please.
I was actually curious about the planes as well. Do you know when the first one started to happen, and why did it slowly stop? Is it because the plane itself, that model, was decommissioned, or did other planes continue to have this until the military came up with different protocols?
So are you talking about nose art in general, not just 509th nose art?
Yeah, just in general.
And this relates to your question too. There's sources that go back to World War I. Disney, for example, was an ambulance driver, and he put an image on his ambulance. There's images on ships, any kind of vehicle, probably that you can imagine. It's a way to claim it, personify it, make it your own, and label it with nose art. And there's so much about Nozart. I apologize, I was probably only able to give you half of what I would have loved to tell you. But not only is it important that we continue to tell these stories, unfortunately the practice of Nozart is off and on. There are some squadrons that have actually been approved, like a guard unit in, because I met somebody in the unit, she gave me her patch, the Memphis Belle in Tennessee, and she said that their unit actually has official approval. They have the official Memphis Belle Nozart on their patch. But it's important to preserve these stories, but then it also is important to create conversations about future conflicts and helping people with PTSD. There was a documentary, we're talking about movies, that I saw at Oshkosh a few years ago and met the director, and it was called Take Me Home Huey. And it was about restoring this medevac helicopter that they were able to find the remaining crew members that had not died in the accident, and through the restoration of it and adorning it with things that were important to them at the time, it was really able to help them with PTSD. And if we were able to look at some of these other ways that people are expressing themselves in situations like war, then maybe we could have more conversations and help people in ways that can help them move forward.
Thank you so much. I want